All right, so what we have here today is a coilover. This is a Fox Performance Series 2.5, and we'll just start from the top. Now let's start from the bottom, it's better. So we're down here at the bottom. We call this an eyelet. It's also called a rod guide, a rod loop, an end loop, a rod end. Lots of people call it different things. We call this an eyelet because that's just what I always learned. And most of my terminology comes from Fox. Not that I have a preference, just that that's what the stuff was I worked on most of the time. Coming up from the eyelet, there's a rubber piece called the bottom out bumper. The bottom out bumper, they can be tall, foam style, or they can be just a small rubber piece. They're really there just to keep the metal on metal clank from happening when you bottom out. They can swish to near zero, so when you bottom out hard, they do squish to near zero, so we don't even acknowledge them on the shock when we do any of our measurements. Then we have the lower spring perch. Lower spring perch, obviously spring sits on it, that's the lower spring perch, and pretty much self-explanatory. We can move up from there. I'll move this around so you can see. This would be called the wiper cap. The wiper cap because it's the cap and it threads into or onto the bearing or the rod guide inside to keep it from shuttling. And then that's a phenomenon where the shaft presses into the shock really fast or plunges into the shock really fast, and the rod guide actually moves like this with the oil, moves the IFP. That can be bad. Wear out seals, can dislodge the snap ring, lots of things that can happen. So you don't want that. So that's the wiper cap. And then we have the body or the can or the cylinder, whatever. That's the silver part, usually made of steel, sometimes aluminum. This one is steel and zinc coated. Pretty self-explanatory. On a coilover, it will be threaded or have some sort of groove in it to allow you to adjust preload. Then we have the spring divider, also called the slider, and 100 other things, but that's called the spring divider, and that divides the two springs or separates the two springs. And from there we have the crossover rings, or the canceling nuts, or the slider stops, or a bunch of slang for them, but we call these crossover rings because they control the crossover from combined rate to singular rate on the bottom. Moving up from there, we have the preload ring, upper spring perch, whatever you want to call it. We call it the preload ring, and this one is a clamp style. So there's a Allen bolt that you tighten here and tightens this to clamp on to lock it in place. I like that style as long as you don't forget to tighten that, and it skips threads and then it ruins it. Sometimes there's a lock nut on top of it, and that would be called just the preload lock ring. And then we have the body cap. We call it the body cap or the end cap, and it carries the spherical bearing. And then obviously remote reservoir. This one's a remote reservoir with the -10 hose. -10 hose. And then it goes into the reservoir. This is the reservoir. This happens to be a DSC reservoir. Really good thing. The DSC, people call it the adjuster, but really it's what they call a base valve. And the base valve comes from a long time ago. Early 70s was the first patent. And all that's happened is they've developed a way to make the base valve, which is to stop cavitation initially, but they've made a way to make it to be able to preload the base valve and then bleed oil past the base valve to make it do more or less work, and so you have some adjustability because it does create some force. Then we have the reservoir. Inside the reservoir is an internal floating piston, and then the Schrader end cap on this side right there has a Schrader valve. These particular ones happen to be aluminum. Pretty good reservoir, hard anode, all good. And so that's the basic parts of a coilover shock. So let's talk about why we use a coilover shock. Well, obviously you need a spring. in the suspension, some sort of suspending member. Usually it's a spring, coil spring, leaf spring, torsion spring, some sort of spring. This is a convenient way to carry the spring and have the shock or the damper and have it all mount in on the same location. So you only have to make a damper mount, and then the suspending member is mounted over it and makes it easy to mount that and make that work. You'll see cars that have 2 shocks per corner, and there will be a coilover, and then there will also be a bypass shock near it. In that condition, we use the coilover to carry the coil spring and to be the suspended member, the mount for the suspended member, as well as do the low speed damping. That's the low speed damping, and that's really low speed, as in putting on the brakes and having the car dip, accelerating and have the car squat, turning and have the car roll. Those are your low speed events. There's a few others, but that's the main ones, and we control that with the coilover. And then when you hit a bump and you get a high speed event, we want the coilover to be valved in such a way that the shims snap open and get out of the way, and let the bypass or the secondary shock do all the work. And I think that's about it. There are some things that go in here called the misalignment spacers. There can be several different kinds. These happen to be COM 10s, which is 5/8. The 10 is for the amount of 1/16 of an inch, so 5/16. 10 16ths of an inch is 5/8, which is 5/8, so that's why it's called a COM 10. And then you have a misalignment spacer that seats into this 5/8 spherical bearing, and then has a 1/2 inch bolt through, and it can be 1.5 or 1.25, whatever you buy, or any custom distance it has to be for the mounting width of the tabs. Okay, so here's a couple different shocks here. Oh, put another one up in there. We've heard all about this one, so let's take this one out of the way. And let's talk about, we'll move to this one, which is very similar to the one that just left. This is a off-road, a Fox off-road race version. Spring divider's the same. Lower eyelet rod loop is similar. This is what we call the spring perch clamshell. There should be 2 of them. There's only one. Probably needed that out of King of the Hammers, and we borrowed it. Same bottom out bumper, relatively similar wiper cap. Shaft on this is better. It's a 17.4H 900, or at least that's what it's supposed to be. Shaft instead of induction hardened. The body is similar, but then we get up here. This is what I was talking. There's your preload ring and your preload lock ring, and then you'll notice that there's a piggyback reservoir, and this is a bridge that goes around the shock and is held in place because the body cap on this one's slightly bigger, and then this lock ring tightens against it, but it's rotatable. It can go anywhere you want. And then obviously piggyback reservoir. What's the difference? Not a lot of difference. I find that the piggyback reservoir, especially this older design, chokes. It causes a bit of harshness when the shaft speeds get high because there's not enough flow area, in my opinion. I would rather have a -10 shaft like the one we looked at. Sorry, a -10 hose. I'd rather have a -10 hose like the one that just left, because the hole that actually feeds this is not much more than 1/4, and the diameter of the reservoir is not very big, which means the internal floating piston has to move more than if it was a 2.5 inch reservoir. And let's talk about the reservoir. Why is the reservoir there? When the shaft plunges into the shock, there's oil. This thing's all full of oil, no air. And when that shaft plunges into the shock, the oil has to go somewhere. So it is pushed up, it goes out the top through holes around the top of the shock, through this bridge, and then there's an internal floating piston in here. That internal floating piston is pushed down exactly the volume of the shaft that is plunged in. So whatever the shaft plunges in, the volume of that pushes that much oil into here. So that means the size of a reservoir can be very critical to the performance of a shock. If you're low shaft speed, not moving anything fast, street only application, you can have a relatively small reservoir. But if you're off-road and you have a lot of heat buildup, so the oil swells, you have a lot of time where the shaft plunges in quickly and the IFP needs to move quickly, a bunch of other parameters. We find that there is a formula that I'm not going to get into, but there's a formula where you have to have so much nitrogen volume for the amount of oil displaced, and it's generally dictated by the area of the shaft, how much oil is being displaced. And that's why you will see smaller reservoirs on smaller shocks, bigger reservoirs on bigger shocks. And if you ever run a big shaft like this, a 7/8 shaft in a small shock, you should switch to the bigger reservoir, bigger hose, because that's what's dictating the amount of flow into the reservoir. I like the piggyback reservoir for mounting. I like the piggyback reservoir for everything, but in a race truck, and this actually is off a Mason truck, a Mason 6100, the older one, not the new one they're building now, but the older one. I don't particularly like this setup, and when we run this shock, if we run this shock on the Mason truck, we will put a different bridge and a different reservoir. May even make it remote, but probably keep the rotatable. And that's that one. So that's a good shock to talk about. That's my personal shock there. This is another one of my shocks. This is for a Jeep. It's a King smooth body, no coilover, no place to carry the coil. Because Jeeps obviously have their coil springs or their leaf springs mounted separately. Smooth body, reservoir comes out the top, just out the side. It's a pin top mount, meaning it uses a stock mounting pin location. Reservoir is mounted with a clamp, to make it as short as possible, to have as much travel as possible. King does a pretty cool thing where they weld the lower eyelet, which is a spherical ball holder. They weld it to the shaft and then weld this washer on for the bottom mount washer. Here's the misalignment spacers I was talking about. These are well embedded. They're hard to get out. One day I'll show you a trick on those on these videos. And that's a smooth body. Pretty typical Jeep JK smooth body shock. Here is a shock. Got some interesting things on it. This is the front of a Pro R, I'm gonna say. It's either a Polaris Pro R or a Polaris Turbo R, but I believe this one's a Pro R, if I know what shock these are. They have this kind of cool clevis design on the bottom. This clevis goes onto a mount on the A-arm, and the axle actually runs through it. And the axle runs through it, and when you build a stock one, if you don't get the spring perch turned, which has a slot in it to go over instead of being full around like that, it's got a slot that goes over the shaft. If you don't get it turned so that it's pointing this way, the axle will actually touch the spring perch when it fully droops out. We typically, for race cars, limit Pro R fronts and rears to keep the spring, or to keep the CV angles a little bit more civilized, and we don't get so hot that way. They don't get so hot, don't spit boots that way. Here's an example of a foam bottom out bumper. These squish even more than the hard rubber ones like that. So if you're measuring shafts, you measure through it, act like it's not there. Everything else is very similar. Reservoir is, this is called an over the cap design or over the top design, and that makes you able to let the shock be a bit shorter, because if this were inside, like this one, which goes down in, which the thread's inside the body, then the piston can't go in that area. But when it's over the top of the body, the piston can plunge up and be in that area and stop 1/8 of an inch or so short, and that allows you, with the over the top design, the shock to be a little bit shorter. I believe this shock is actually a modified Polaris XP1000 rear to go on the front of a Pro R, so we can get a 3-inch internal bypass with the standard DSC adjuster. This is the Power Sports DSC adjuster, same principle as the other one we showed you, slightly different, but pretty much the same principle. instead of being just a shim stack that's preloaded, there's actually a big spring that's preloaded. But same thing, bleed through, preload the shims. The oil displaced by the shaft has to push the shims out of the way for the oil to get in the reservoir, and then it comes back in freely, and it's basically how they work. Again, size of the reservoir, you'll notice this is 2.5, and it is not as long, but we only have, I think, 11 inches of travel on these, and so 11 inches times a 5/8 shaft, and then we know that, and then we do know the area. We know the area of this piston, which is about 4 square inches, and then we know we need, you know, X amount more than that for nitrogen stability, room for heat growth. You know, when the oil gets hot, it swells, so room for heat growth. This wiper cap isn't really wiper cap; it is just a cap. This is also internal bypass. It has a sleeve inside a sleeve. I'll get something similar so you can see. So this is not one for this, but this has got a sleeve inside it, something like this, and it stops there, and the bearing clamps on it, and it pushes up into the cap. And so this is actually your damper, and then there's oil that bypasses through ports inside of this inside. So this is an internal bypass, and this is one type of an internal bypass, which is basically a twin tube. That's what they would call this. Another type of internal bypass would be a needle style, and that's where they have a hole in the top of the shaft. And I'm going to pause you here, and I'm going to get one, and then we can look at that. Okay, I wanted to show you this. This is a King internal bypass shaft, and you'll notice the ports right here, and you'll notice a hole in the end of the shaft. You can see that, I think. And so what happens is there's the regular piston lives about here, and then there's what we call the spool. It's red usually. Some are gold from way back in the day, but they're red now, I think. And it has shims on them exactly the same as the piston. And when the shaft is plunging through the shock like that, oil goes into this hole, bypasses, comes into the spool, and comes out the spool through a stack of shims. And then a needle will go into the hole, and it travels down the hole, you know, as far as it needs to. But as soon as it enters, it starts to close off flow, and it eventually gets a very tight fit, and that bronze bushing in there, and it closes off that flow, and then the rest of the flow is restricted to only the main piston, and that's how they work, the needle style. And Walker Evans do the same thing or similar, and yeah, so want to show you that. Okay, so here we've got, make sure you can see the shock. Here we've got a smooth body Fox Performance Series, very well used. IFP series, which means there's an internal floating piston here, and they use the top part of the shock as the reservoir filled through here. These are kind of not the lowest entry level, but the Performance Series, the affordable level shock. It's got some good technology in it, kind of the same piston, valving, all that as a race shock. Impact forged body that have some issues occasionally. We see side load on these, wear them out inside. See emulsification of the IFP occasionally, well, quite often. And they're really difficult to set the IFP without the special tool they have at the factory to build them. So these are, although you can take them apart and rebuild them, we kind of don't. Why don't we? Just because by the time we spend all our time rebuilding and all that stuff and give you the cost of our labor and all that stuff, it's honestly cheaper to go buy a new set. Same with revalving. It's difficult to do because you have to take them apart, set the IFP, make sure the IFP didn't move when you put them back together, and without the tool that they have at the factory, it's difficult to do. So we don't see enough of them to do that many. So honestly, decent shock, not a bad thing, probably better than the white rockets you see, but It's just one step up from White Rocket Monroe or something. This is another one. It's off a Jeep. What happens with these is side loading will pull the pin out. The aluminum thread's pretty, I don't want to say fragile, but they're not terribly strong. So you side load these, you pull the pin out, then the rest of the shock's good, but you can't mount them because the pin's been pulled out. The Performance Series is not a bad way to go. If you got an F-350, you know, a Chevy, a Ford, Toyota, whatever, and you're just looking to get new quality shocks that do a little better than what you can buy at AutoZone, not a bad shock. I don't think I would consider them rebuildable. It's possible if you want to go through the heartache and sorrow, but for us it's really honestly cheaper for you to buy a new one than to rebuild them. That's coilovers and smooth body shocks 101. If I missed anything, feel free to comment down below and I will answer, and maybe even put another video out if there's something interesting I missed. Probably is. There's a lot to go over. Wanted to show you this. This is the piece I couldn't find when I had that smooth body shock in my hand, the Fox Performance Series that had lost the upper stem. That's the stem mount for a Jeep, or Jeep's the most common, I think. But they have that stem mount with the bushings, and that's what pulls out. It's just a 7/8 piece of 20 pitch thread, and it's only about 400 thou long, and if you side load those they can pull out, but I found that after I shut the camera off. Couldn't find it when I was seeing it. So the basics of coilovers and smooth bodies. If you like what you saw, hit the like button. I could ask you to subscribe. It's a lot easier for me to make videos if I get subscribers, and it helps the channel, helps me get more content out as we get deeper and deeper into it. And hit the notification bell. There's a new video coming out. We're doing them a little more than once a week right now, just because we have a bunch of content from the King of the Hammers race and a little family trip we took out there afterwards. So there's a lot of stuff on film we're working through. Part 2, a little teaser for part 2, where we're going to go over external bypass shocks and all the different varieties that are out there and kind of how they work, and should be interesting kind of flow here, and we can do more parts if you guys want us to see it. And if you have any questions, again, comment down below and I'll do my best to get you answered. And having a lot of fun doing these, so I hope you're enjoying watching them. Thanks for watching.